Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Levins. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's Government Affairs Forum, which we've titled the Minnesota Legislative Session Unprecedented Edition. Let's do a little housekeeping. This morning, audio and video functions have been disabled for you. However, we are really excited to take your questions, so please do that by using the Q&A function. If for any reason you're having any issues, you can communicate with the host using the chat feature. We'll include some information in that chat space as we move along. Please engage with us on Twitter today. Our handle is at MPLS Chamber, and we're using the hashtag Government Affairs Forum. It's my pleasure today to get us started. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Without their support, we would not be able to provide this sort of programming to you. So I'd like to thank our premier sponsors this morning: Centerpoint Energy, Mortenson, Target, Wells Fargo, and Xcel Energy. Again, their commitment and investment in this program allows us to continue to bring this to you 5 times a year. With that, I'd like to quickly just go right into our show and introduce you to our guest today. Grace Walls is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. Brian McClung is the co-CEO and senior principal of Park Street Public. And our moderator today is the amazing Tane Danger, host of the Theater for Public Policy. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Tane. I'll be moderating both the chat and the Q&A function. So off we go, Tane. It's all you.
Hey, thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much to the Minneapolis Chamber for hosting this. Thank you, everybody who's here. This is very exciting. This is very good. There's a lot to talk about. I'm very glad to be back with Grace and Brian. So this is just a fun fact. I imagine a lot of people here were here the last time we did this. And the last time we did this, the morning we did it, President Trump had been diagnosed with COVID the day before. This morning we're coming on, and yesterday President Trump was impeached for a second time yesterday. So we have really good timing. And I'm going to just sort of start with a very blanket question for both of you. Where are we? Where are we right at this particular moment, sort of as a table setting? Because it feels like the last week has been a decade or more. Grace, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Well, good. Me first. I mean, it's kind of, at least for me personally, it's basically impossible to wrap my mind around where we are right now, because exactly like you said, every day for the last week or so, and really every day for the last year, has felt like a year. And every time we kind of take a step forward in what feels like we're making hopefully some good progress, something else horrible happens. And I mean, just thinking about yesterday, I think impeachment was an appropriate step, but it seems that we are headed into what could potentially be a terrifying weekend in this country. And of course, next week should be an exciting week with the inauguration of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. But that's kind of being overshadowed a little bit by everything, all the threats and everything else that's happening in the world right now. So I am trying to remain optimistic, because next week should be a moment where the country is really able to start moving forward. Obviously, I'm not being Pollyannish about it. It's still going to be an incredibly difficult week, and I think the next couple of days will be telling of what next week will feel like. But I'm trying to stay optimistic the best that I can.
Brian, what are you thinking this morning?
Well, what I'm reflecting on is that, a week ago Wednesday, there was an insurrection. Yesterday, Wednesday, there was an impeachment. And next Wednesday, there's an inauguration. So 3 weeks in a row, these really dramatic events and unfolding at the U.S. Capitol, and it's very unsettling. I think it's unsettling for our politics, and it's unsettling for the nation. This period, this kind of the beginning of January, when a new president is being sworn in, is typically kind of a time of renewal, of feeling kind of a refreshed sense of that American promise of a peaceful transition of power, and all the pomp and circumstance that goes along with an inauguration. And that has been wiped away. And not only wiped away, but I think dramatically damaged by the insurrection at the Capitol a week and a day ago, and by some what led up to that. So it is really, I think, very difficult. It's hard to even know what to expect day to day. And it's hard to know, for example, what the inauguration will look like next Wednesday. We all kind of have a vision of what that is. And I don't know if it's safe to do it that way. I don't know if they will do it that way. And that's really a difficult and unsettling position, I think, for the country to be in, to not even feel good about a new president coming into office and talking about their vision and the direction they want to take the country.
So I promised to our folks who are listening and watching today, this is a panel about the upcoming legislative session and whatnot. I do feel like talking about some of these national things are important because they shape in a lot of ways how some of the things here are going to happen. So just as a follow-up, Brian, your former boss, Tim Pawlenty, had this very good line last week when some of this was coming about. He said, the Republican Party has taken the elevator to the basement with a thud. As I've been thinking about that, though, my question has been, have there been a lot of Republicans who are like, yes, we are in the basement, and wow, there's a lot of voters down here for us, and that starts to shape what, and maybe is shaping right now, sort of how the party is functioning. And I'm wondering if you see something that is your former boss, Tim Pawlenty, is saying, no, we need to come up out of the basement or whatnot. I'm wondering if he's a voice in the wilderness or if there's more to it than that.
Well, that's what we're going to find out over this next, year or two. Yesterday, 10 Republicans in the U.S. House voted to impeach President Trump. That's the largest number of the members of a president's own party ever to support impeachment. In fact, it's double the amount that has ever voted for the impeachment of a president of their own party. So there are at least 10 Republicans in the U.S. House. And I think more than that number in the U.S. Senate, Republicans that are willing to stand up against what President Trump has done, against the fact that he incited this insurrection at the Capitol. And, some of this is, of course, it's politicians playing politics, right? And that's we shouldn't be surprised. It's disheartening sometimes, but we shouldn't be surprised. And so, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz placed a bet on their future political careers, by tying themselves to President Trump's base. And, other Republicans are not, and are saying that that's the wrong direction. And so that's the battle that's going to unfold. I think that that's a terrible move. I think that's the wrong move. I think people are going to come around to the fact that President Trump bears responsibility for the insurrection at the Capitol, that his words mattered, that lying to his base for years made a difference and created that situation that lit the spark that ended up with 5 people dead, including a U.S. Capitol police officer. So that's really, the Republican Party is in the wilderness. Democrats took control of the U.S. Senate with those elections in Georgia. And so Democrats are going to control the Senate, the House, the presidency. So Republicans are going to be on the outside for a while. And when you're on the outside, that's when it's time to do some examination. I can't predict where that's going to go. I know where I come down. But we'll see, how, elected officials and the party base go over time.
Well, so that's a great transition into how I was hoping to bring this back more to Minnesota, which is that party-based piece, or even just voters in general. I've been trying to wrap my head around what is it that voters are wanting or expecting of their, elected officials. We're in a new Minnesota legislative session. We're heading into a new Congress, a new presidency. And this will be a question I'm interested for both of you. But again, just Brian, I'll start with you. What are Republican voters, the folks that, put a lot of these people in office, expecting of their members? Are there tangible things that they are saying, we are sending you there to do X?
Yeah, and that's part of the problem with the way that politics has unfolded over the last, decade or more. And that is that it's really just become a fight and a battle, right? Like Republicans on Twitter, are all about owning the libs, right? Like that's their greatest achievement. Oh, I own the libs. Well, that's ludicrous. I mean, this is not a policy direction. This is not accomplishing, what my sense of what republicanism is, and my sense of that is that it's about, smaller and efficient government. It's about more personal freedoms. It's about putting more power in the hands of individuals and states. They're not talking about those kinds of things anymore. They're talking about the fight. And part of it is, I think, the way our system is set up, it rewards that kind of extremism, especially in the caucus system where our endorsements take place. The people that are willing to participate these days in a caucus system where you have to go on a Tuesday night to a school or a community center and then go back on a Saturday a couple weeks after that and go back on a Saturday a month after that to eventually get elected to endorse somebody. I mean, it is not a user-friendly modern system. And so the people who are most passionate, who are most fired up, right, those are the ones who show up. And so the politicians are most concerned about those voices, because those are the voices that keep them in office or not. And I think we have to have an examination of how that works if we're going to kind of level things out over time.
So Grace, coming to you, I'm taking a lot of hard questions to Brian. In fairness, you look at the election in November. Yes, Democrats ended up taking control of the U.S. Senate. They held on to the House, although they lost seats. When we talked last fall, we were talking a lot about, will Democrats take over the entire Minnesota legislature? That did not happen. So it does seem like for Democrats, there's also this, there was obviously people who really didn't like Trump and didn't vote for it, but I did not see some sort of wholesale buying of like, yup, we really are all in on the DFL Democratic agenda going forward. Did you read that differently? Is that a fair assessment of sort of how November played out?
Yeah, so I mean, this is just such a bizarre and unique snapshot in political history. So it's really, I think I have a hard time, assigning any particular assessment to this particular election. And just like to piggyback off of what Brian was just saying too, it should be noted that while it's a good thing that there were 10 House Republicans that voted for impeachment, if you look at the districts that those Republicans came from, by and large, Biden carried those districts by fairly significant margins. But I hope just from like a national perspective going forward, we are looking at this time, like there's been all these calls for unity and things like that. And I think the line that has really struck with me is there cannot be any unity without accountability. And accountability is not shaming people on Twitter and calling people out, because in order for shaming to be effective, the person needs to feel shame. And I think that is really unlikely in this case. So that's why we need some real accountability. And then going back to the election, I am by no means trying to set up an equivalency to the soul searching that the Republican Party needs to be doing right now. But to your point, it is a little bit true that I think Democrats will have to think about what our elections look like going forward when Trump is hopefully permanently no longer on the ballot. I'll note in the state of Minnesota, if my pillow guy runs for governor, it's going to be a little bit of the same thing. So we may kind of end up in the same exact position. But I think going forward, it will hopefully be a little less of this is the most consequential election of our lifetime, you have to vote or everything's going to be horrible. So yes, I think there perhaps is going to be a little more not direct Trump messaging that's going to need to happen. But I think the things that Democrats have always run on are the same things that people are looking for. They're looking for, particularly in the time of a pandemic, which I don't think we should forget that we are still living in a pandemic. So people are looking to make sure workers are protected. They're looking to make sure that their healthcare is affordable. They're looking to make sure childcare is affordable. And they're looking to make sure that our economy recovers in a way that's going to be more equitable for people than it was before. And those are things that Democrats have been running on. And I don't see Democrats changing on those issues. And I think those are going to continue to be good issues moving forward.
So we're in a legislative session now. This is a budget session. So I think that the question probably almost everybody watching is wondering is, what should we expect what what are people trying to get done, if anything? What has to get done? Is there any room for some of these things that you're talking about to happen? Brian, I could start with you.
Yeah, I think so. In this legislative session, I think of it as 4 R's in 3 buckets. So the first is relief and recovery. The second is redistricting. And the third is reconciliation. And by that, I'll start with that one. I mean, reconciliation of the state budget. So they're required to do a state budget. The 2-year budget that starts on July 1st, there's a deficit of about $1.3 billion forecast right now. We'll get another budget forecast at the end of February, beginning of March. So that will provide us with the number for the budget negotiations. So that's, first and foremost, that's got to get done. And 4 out of the last 5 budget setting sessions have seen the legislature go into overtime to get it done, into special session. And in the course of that period of time, we've even had 1 state government shutdown. So I think that's the thing. Minnesota has the only divided legislature in the country, as we know, and we talked about that a fair amount. But now with the U.S. Senate, with Democrats taking control of the U.S. Senate, we're the only divided legislative body in the entire nation, federal or state. And so the question is, as this legislature tackles the budget, can we find a bipartisan way to make progress on that and get that done? Or do we end up in special sessions headed towards shutdown, that kind of thing? Is that the impression that they want to leave with the voters of Minnesota, coming out of this session? Redistricting also has to get done. That'll end up going to a judicial panel because presumably a divided legislature is not going to agree on a redistricting map. Minnesota has gone to a judicial panel in every redistricting since 1970. So this is not new, it's typical. And the judges tend to draw kind of a least changes map. So they look at those legislative districts and just try to tweak them based essentially on population. But the work that the legislature does influences those judges who are looking, to draw the maps. So it's still really important work that gets done by the House and Senate on redistricting to set that up for the maps that will come out in early 2022. And then the first one I mentioned, relief and recovery, there's still a lot that our small businesses need. There's a lot, especially those that were impacted by social unrest in Minneapolis. A lot of first generation immigrant and BIPOC owned businesses that need state support. That we're not able to cover their rebuilding costs. And so I think the state needs to play a role in that. And I think more broadly, there's COVID relief and recovery that the legislature can undertake from a state level, but there'll also be federal money coming through as a result of the package that was passed by the Congress in December. And I think certainly we expect there'll be more money passed by the Democrat-controlled U.S. Congress and the Biden administration here in the not too distant future, including money to state and local government, which was not part of those first 2 COVID relief packages. So I think it's that relief and recovery, redistricting, reconciliation. That's kind of the agenda that I think they'll try to bite off this session.
Grace, is that, do you agree that that's sort of the framework of what we're going to do? And then B, if it is, it feels like there's a lot that's not there that, we were talking about in the run-ups to the elections last year.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that those should all be the primary priorities because, again, we are still living in a pandemic that is impacting Minnesotans drastically every single day. And it's obviously positive news that we are making progress on vaccinations, but it will still be a few, if not several months before a majority of Minnesotans are vaccinated. And there are a lot of Minnesotans that are still hurting. And it should be pointed out, like, it may not feel like it because of how many special sessions we have had, but this is a part-time legislature. So this is the time that they are supposed to be doing their work. And there is absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be. And I think this, in just thinking about, budget negotiations are always controversial, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. But my potentially controversial opinion is that we do not need to be starting the 2022 elections now, especially as we are approaching a crucial budget negotiations. Like, I think that needs to be set aside a little bit because Minnesotans always need the money that comes from these decisions, but particularly this year, Minnesotans really need the legislature to get things done. And to Brian's point, particularly on disaster relief, I found it really disappointing that one of the first things that House Republicans rolled out was that they want to change the state emergency funding laws so it wouldn't cover civil unrest in the same way that it would cover something like a tornado or flooding. I think that sends the wrong message. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, we have until May, and statutorily the budget needs to be done by July. And I think we've all gotten so used to things going into overtime, but I don't think that means that things necessarily have to go into overtime. We have plenty of time to get things done, and I would hope things will be done on time.
So I want to dig into each of these, particularly like COVID, the budget, and whatnot. But I just want to, again, sort of frame this for folks, because I got to imagine there's a lot of folks watching who have particular things that they're thinking about, like, oh, you know, I was hoping that there would be legislation on this or a fix to this or a change to this. And I don't know, maybe this is me being overly cynical, but it kind of sounds like both of you are saying, like, don't get your hopes up, folks. Like, this is going to be sort of like a we're going to get through it session. Is that fair, Brian?
That's fair. And, you know, I've heard legislators in these first 2 weeks talk about, you know, the fact that they say, we're not going to be able to do things that are controversial this year. Like, this is not the year for that. We need to get the budget done. You know, we need to take care of some of these basic things. And we're mostly meeting it remotely. And so, you know, that it does make it harder for lawmakers to work things out, get to a deal when they don't have the opportunity to sit in a committee room together or to have those sidebar conversations that matter. And we all know in our personal lives and in our workplace, you know, that's kind of where things get done. Like when you build trust with somebody and you're able to kind of get to know them on a personal level, and you can find a way to yes. And they're lacking that right now. And so you've got, you know, a new group of lawmakers that were just elected for the first time. So as freshmen, they're, you know, entering into the Zoom legislature. You know, Speaker Hortman has said that the House is going to be working remotely through May 31st. In the Senate, they're working remotely in January and then in February trying to transition to kind of a hybrid. You know, they're saying they're going to have a super Zoom where they're going to use technology so that, you know, committee testimony, you can, like, some people can be there, some people can be remote. So they're trying to work that in a little bit, but I think it's still very difficult. So yes, I think that under the circumstances, many lawmakers will say, we just can't hash out the controversial this year. Let's stick to the basics. And so that's difficult because there are a lot of good things that one side or the other are going to flag as controversial and kind of make it difficult for that to move forward. And it's frankly harder to, you know, put pressure on lawmakers and move things along when you don't have the opportunity to meet with them in person or reach out to them the way that you can in a normal session. I mean, think of all the day at the Capitals that are lost, right? All of those groups, you know, Bemidji Day at the Capitol, everybody in their, you know, plaid flannel marching around the Capitol, like, that adds to the life of our politics and what happens at the legislature. And, you know, we just don't have the opportunity to do that this year. So I think they will find a way to get some of these other policy things done and sorted out. But really those that they can find consensus on or that are not too overly controversial.
Grace, and what I will add on is I see no reason. I think it's probably right that the chances of any legislation outside of things that are kind of just putting a Band-Aid on things is a little bit unlikely, but I don't think that we can't also use this session to start laying the groundwork for future sessions and really using this time to think about what our state and what our economy is going to look like once we are past this pandemic. And from the Chamber's perspective, things that we are really thinking about are transit and transportation infrastructure, really kind of reimagining what that system looks like in this state. So it's not just about getting someone from their home to their office, not only because some people may not be going back to their offices, but really how do we set up a system where people are able to use transit if they choose to get around in their everyday lives? Because unless you live downtown, that just really isn't an option for you. And additional priorities I think that should be talked about are housing for sure, particularly like inevitably, eventually this eviction moratorium is going to be lifted. So we should be thinking about ways that we can ease the strain on, there already is a strain on housing. So think about what we can be doing now to make sure that we don't end up with thousands of additional homeless Minnesotans. And then thinking about ways to make sure that we are keeping up that talent pipeline and keeping our workforce levels up. And one of the things that I hope will continue to be a priority in this session that I know House Democrats have talked about is childcare. And that's been one of the main things that we've been talking about throughout this pandemic, particularly as it relates to keeping and kind of getting back women in the workforce. So those are all issues that even if we're not able to pass things on it this year, I think should still be conversations because they are going to be major contributing factors to the success of the state moving forward.
So that's a really good question, and let's jump into that now because there's a reality on the ground that we are going to be coming out of COVID. Things are going to be really different, and whether we're ready to sort of have the debate or not, like things are going to be changing, and it's sort of a question of if there's anybody there to pick up the ball and run with it. I am, Grace, I totally hear you in saying these are things we should be talking about. What does transit look like? What is housing policy? How are we thinking about that going out? Maybe I'll throw it to Brian. Is anybody excited or ready to pick up that ball and run with it this session?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are lawmakers, that have put in a lot of time and work on transportation, for example. You have, very strong leadership at the Department of Transportation with Margaret Anderson Kelleher. As a former Speaker of the House, she knows how to, work things at the Capitol. And I do think that there will be renewed federal interest in funding infrastructure. During the Trump years, he'd have a press conference on Infrastructure Week and then blow that out of the water 10 minutes later with a tweet. I think the Biden administration is going to say it's Infrastructure Week, month, year, whatever, and do it. And I think they showed that mattered to them by naming Pete Buttigieg as the next Secretary of Transportation. So I think there will be increased, federal interest, which, is important to doing a lot of these big transit and transportation projects. And I think what's important for lawmakers to think about along those lines is, we are going to be coming out of this pandemic, in the second half of 2021. And so states and regions that position themselves for growth are, it's going to matter. Businesses and people are going to gravitate to those communities and those states that have a game plan for growth and reinvigoration and, making their economies more equitable. And, we can do that. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota has the foundation of, these strong Fortune 500 companies, lots of good entrepreneurs and mid-sized businesses. And so we already have the footings. We just need the political will, I think, to invest and take that seriously and say to the world, we are ready to go. We recognize and understand how things are going to be different coming out of this, and invest in those things. And I do, I mentioned in the reconciliation part of my R's, we have a $1.3 billion deficit forecast. But I think that the federal government is going to send money to states and to, local units of government as part of a COVID relief package in the first part of this year. And so that deficit is likely to be wiped out. And we may even have some extra money as a result of those federal funds. So then it's a question of what can we come together on to invest that to position, ourselves for economic growth.
Brian, follow-up question. What can we come together on to position ourselves to invest in future economic growth? And more specifically, the political question is there an appetite in an increasingly rural, centered Republican Party to make big investments in transit and housing and these things that would be largely metro-centric?
Well, I'll start with housing because housing is an issue statewide. And, we see places like Thief River Falls, where DigiKey has invested in, providing housing and is busing workers in from far away because they can't find housing close enough to their workplace. So housing is a statewide issue. And so I think that there is bipartisan support for doing more on housing. And I think that'll end up being a combination both of, support for incentives for building, but also looking at regulations and looking at ways to, have a balance there and a trade in some of what Republicans tend to talk about around housing and some of what Democrats tend to talk about around housing. In transportation and transit, I think that it's a tough issue. It's been hard. Republicans don't like light rail. Like we know that, like we're fooling ourselves if we think that that's going to change. But Republicans have shown a willingness to support bus rapid transit. And so we have, a BRT system that includes, dedicated lane BRT like Gold Line and Rush Line. And then we have this arterial bus rapid transit system that's growing like A Line and the B Line and D Line across the metro. And I think that even, greater Minnesota representatives recognize and believe that the rural economy, greater Minnesota's economy is in fact tied to what happens in the Twin Cities. I mean, we are all one. A lot of, the growth matters. These are companies that do business with companies that are in the Twin Cities. We're all interconnected. And so we can't imagine that an investment, in Brooklyn Park does not support something that's going on in International Falls. It's all part of our, economic infrastructure. So I think housing, transportation, and I think workforce development, where we talk about training the workers for the jobs of tomorrow. There's a really interesting report that's coming out soon from the Center for Rural Policy and Development, looking at the fact that we have a lot of people who are unemployed right now in Minnesota, and even more so in greater Minnesota than the Twin Cities. We have a lot of job openings too. And so the issue is there's a mismatch between the people who are unemployed and the types of jobs that are available. But the state can play a role in investing in workforce development and training programs that can help people transition into those jobs. So I do think, again, that's an area that Democrats and Republicans, I think, both agree on.
Grace, let me just, and I have to move on in a moment, but I do want to touch on the child care piece. Is there a child care bill that does get bipartisan support? I know that there's, people have made a lot of Ivanka Trump and Meghan McCain coming out over the last year or so and saying, oh yeah, this is really a thing Republicans should champion. Is there something here in Minnesota that you can see actually moving forward?
I mean, to the conversation that we were having before about kind of what are considered metro issues versus rural issues. And one thing before I get to the childcare piece that we haven't talked about yet is broadband. And that is something that is important to everyone, but particularly important in rural Minnesota and was before the pandemic. Like I remember hearing stories about kids who were having to do homework on the school bus because they didn't have good Wi-Fi at home. And now with so many people working from home, you're hearing stories about people having to like sit in parking lots because that's the only place where they can get internet. So that's another one where I think there could be bipartisan support. And from a childcare perspective, and again, this was an issue before the pandemic, this is a huge issue in rural Minnesota from an access perspective, because a lot of it's fairly easy in the cities to find a childcare provider nearby. That doesn't necessarily mean it's affordable, but in rural Minnesota, you may not be able to find a childcare provider that is within a reasonable distance. So I think that's where the two-pronged approach of affordability, which may not be as palatable from a bipartisan perspective, but I think access is one that I would hope that people can both get on board with, because if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's just not reasonable for people to be able to do school at home, watch out for their kids, and do their jobs at the level that they need to be doing. And in order to be able to achieve all those things, they need to be able to have not just access, but ideally affordable childcare as well. So I hope the access piece is where we'll be able to get some bipartisan support.
So yes, I just don't. I have a hard time. What does that look like? What is the actual bill or structure or something that actually makes that happen?
So
I don't know.
one of the things that I've heard about just in like stories from childcare providers is there are so many of them that are small, just like 1 or 2 people. So they are getting the same amount in past bills. They've been getting same, like it's been an equitable amount of money for a small child care provider versus a large child care provider. And that is something that is probably just not sustainable going forward, because a center that only is in charge of 20 kids has different expenses than a center that is charged with 200 kids. So I think a more targeted approach to the kind of money that these centers are getting will be helpful going forward. And then from an access perspective, if the money is more targeted, that allows these places to stay open, because a lot of these places just had not been able to be able to afford to stay open. And then that decreases the amount of places that people are able to go. So that's why it has to be a two-pronged approach, and I think it's going to need to be more targeted going forward.
So I do see Christine very generously put in the chat. We are accepting questions. I see we got one question already. And I'm going to bring those to you all definitely with the last like 10, 15 minutes we have. But before we do, so we touched on COVID as a thing. That was a huge part of what sort of absorbed our legislative attention over the last 9 months or so. We had these monthly special sessions, which were very contentious. Melissa Hortman, the speaker, suggested that now that legislators are all back in St. Paul together, sort of, at least virtually, that maybe some of that tension will be lessened, because it won't be sort of like that's the only thing to focus on. Is that optimistic? Are we still sort of heading for just very bitter, like Governor Walz, please revoke your powers, otherwise we are going to decapitate more of your commissioners? Or is there some path forward, maybe with the temperature lowered?
Yeah, it's not lowered. Like I mean, that's hopeful. Maybe it will go down here, you know, after we get through what I think is, as I described, a very nerve-wracking, you know, January. Maybe it can tone down, but, you know, Forum Communications annually has a session where the governor and the 4 legislative leaders they sit together. Typically this year it was on Zoom, and take questions from reporters. And it's normally pretty docile. Like it's the beginning of the session. This is the time to say, like, we're going to find a way to work together. We're going to work it out. I really respect each other, da, da, da. And this year everybody went after each other. I mean, it was really dramatic. So that was this past Monday. And it was largely over, you know, the Republicans and how they were responding to and reacting to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. So I think that, you know, yes, like at least like we're in session right now. So, you know, now until May 17th, there's the opportunity for dialogue between the governor's office and legislators on both sides. So that's helpful. But, you know, the Republicans want Governor Walz to end the use of his emergency powers. And he's not inclined to do that. And as somebody who worked in the governor's office, like, I would not advise the governor to do that. Like, there are things that a governor can do through the executive branch administratively that are faster and more efficient, and that you need to have those tools available to you in an emergency. So from the governor's perspective, totally understand that. From the legislature's perspective, what they've mostly been hearing about from constituents, especially in greater Minnesota, is that they don't like these restrictions and that it's hurting businesses. And, you know, restaurants and the hospitality industry in particular have absolutely been devastated by all of this. And so these legislators are reflecting those concerns when they are, you know, asking the governor to turn the dials or end his emergency powers. Now that they're in session, of course, he doesn't have to call them back every 30 days for a special session. You know, those executive powers do expire after every 30 days. So he has to renew the executive order, but then that's extended by 30 days by the executive board, which is made up of the constitutional officers, and those are all Democrats. So at this stage of the game, I think, I would expect Governor Walz to keep those in place. He sent a letter to legislators saying, if you'd like me to, to dial this back and to drop my executive powers, here's the legislation I need you to agree to so that we could have these things in place, ongoing without the executive order in place. And I think there were, a few things on that list that Republicans are just not going to do. So yes, they're there. They can talk. That's good. Does it turn the temperature down? Not so much.
Well, and the flip side of this, Brian, would a Paul Gazelka or a Kurt Doubt want to really be holding the bag on some of these things, right? If Walz went to them, honest to goodness, and said, come on, guys, let's do this together, would they be like, yeah, we are excited to be with you out on the edge of the plank of figuring out this COVID thing?
Well, and it's difficult to imagine, for example, if you had to go to the legislature and pass legislation every time you were turning the dials on capacity at indoor seating in restaurants, for example. So now we're going to bring the House and the Senate in to vote on, is it 25%? Is it 50%? Is it outdoor? Like, that's not, from my perspective, that's not a great way to run it. So I understand their desire to play a role in kind of the governance of state efforts related to COVID. I mean, it's a co-equal branch of government, but that co-equal branch is the House and Senate together, not one or the other. And so when you have a divided House and Senate, you got to figure out a way for them to have agreement on how they would manage some of these things related to the state's emergency response. And I just think it's relatively unwieldy. We see how the legislature has a hard time with legislation that we would consider to be relatively minor, now asking them to weigh in repeatedly on COVID response. I think it's be very difficult. So I don't think it's the best use of legislative time and effort, especially under this scenario.
Grace, the flip side of this is, Governor Walz has gotten a lot of critique from the legislature and from others that he's making a lot of these decisions on his own. People feel like it is sort of a one, man show or whatnot. I think Brian made a good case for maybe why it has to be that way in certain aspects. But is there anything Governor Walz and his administration could do to make folks at least feel more part of the process and dispel some of that?
Yeah, I mean, Brian laid this out well with just like the advantages of being in an the advantages of having those emergency powers. And it's not like Minnesota is like some special star in this. All 50 states are under some version of an emergency order. So we are by no means the only one. It's because it is much more efficient. And also, like Brian says, it's just simply not realistic that every time we're going to turn the dial that the whole legislature can come back in and debate this. Like, these are truly life and death situations that need to be made quickly. And I would push back on the criticism that Governor Walz is making these decisions on his own, because he's not. He is consulting with experts. He is consulting data. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind with all of this is a lot of the restrictions are put in place are literally to ensure that the hospitals are still able to take people, not even just for COVID stuff, but if someone has a heart attack, if someone gets in a car accident. And that's what we were running into in November when cases were exploding, is hospitals literally could not bring more people in. So that is what he is trying to do when he is putting these restrictions into place. And of course, it's been devastating to businesses. And I'm not going to pretend to, I'm not a business owner, so I'm not going to pretend to imagine what this last year has been like for them. And then
sucks.
Sucks.
Yes.
And that my mother's watching, she's not gonna like that I just said sucks, but it does.
Sorry.
And the other thing I would point out, which I think, Tane, you raised, is does the legislature truly want to own these decisions? Because like I said, these are life and death decisions, and it should not be understated how difficult they are. And I think the governor is a person of integrity that stands up for all of his decisions, even when they are unpopular, and is at the end of the day, always looking out for the best interests of Minnesota. And anyone who's coming to the table and wants to be part of these decisions, I would expect them to hold themselves to those same standards. And I think the other thing that Brian alluded to that would be difficult in bringing people to the table is, in order to have a productive conversation, I think folks need to come to agreement on a basic set of facts and kind of an acknowledgement that scientists around the world have come to in the facts of this pandemic. And the fact that the Senate Republicans couldn't even pass a mask mandate in their own chambers was not necessarily a positive sign that they're open to taking this pandemic as seriously as it should. So I'm not necessarily saying that more voices shouldn't be brought to the table. I just have yet to see anyone come up with a way that would not hamper the ability to get aid to Minnesotans at the speed that they need it.
So the follow-up question, and this is actually coming via the chat in some ways, is you make a good case that, you know, this is maybe how it kind of has to be in certain aspects in order to do it effectively. And yet, will Governor Walz pay a political price for it, even if that's totally, you know, not fair? And the specific question actually is maybe this one is more fair. There's a question here, will the governor get blamed for a slow vaccine rollout in hurting his reelection? And I think you can take that and maybe some of these other pieces. And Grace, I don't know. I think that I wouldn't want to run for election particularly, but I would not want to run for reelection, you know, with this much stuff necessarily to carry. Will he get blamed for kind of the hardship that we've had over the last 9 months? And specifically this vaccine rollout piece, which I think a lot of people are anxious or angry about.
Yeah, I mean, in relation to the vaccine distribution, I think we will hopefully see an expedited process when the Biden administration comes into place, when they are able to just kind of release everything. Right now, states have been a little hamstrung in how they've been able to handle the distribution. And just from a broader perspective, I hope what we see in the new administration is how a national response can actually be more effective, as opposed to what we've seen for the last year almost, which is a kind of state-led response, which is kind of what has led to some of this chaos. And then just going back to the governor being reelected, I mean, and he says this all the time, like, if people do not like his decisions, they don't need to vote for him. And like, that's how elections work. And I think that is why I've always been proud to have him as my governor, is because he is not making these decisions because he thinks that they're going to be politically popular, or he's not making decisions to gain political points. He's making decisions that he thinks are going to save the most lives and do the least amount of damage to businesses. So of course, that's kind of an overlaying piece to all of this. But like I said before, I would really urge folks to try and not think too much about 2022 to the extent that that is possible, and just do the right thing for Minnesotans. I know you're both laughing at me, and I'm
going
sure
to ask Brian a question
too,
about 2022 right now. Sorry. That's a very fair point. And I am going to ask though, Brian, because there is a scenario where I can imagine a Republican person who comes out of business government and says, you know, Governor Walz, he's a good man. I could have done this a lot more efficiently, a lot better. Here are the ways that like I would run this thing better. That does not right now seem to be the direction in some ways Republicans are going with some of this. Grace very generously already brought the name Mike Lindell into this conversation. And again, it kind of goes back to how we started this entire panel conversation. Do you have a sense of sort of like, is that the direction? Like, we are in good faith thinking we can just do this better? Or no, I don't even want to characterize what Mike Lindell sort of runs on.
Right. Neither do I. I would hate to have that segment recorded by somebody and played later as me speaking like I was Mike Lindell. However, I think it's way too early to tell what type of, Republican counterbalance to Tim Walz we'll see in the 2022 elections. I think that there's a lot of, there's so much to talk about, right? I mean, a governor going through a crisis of this magnitude that has lasted this long. Of course, there are things that people will disagree with him on, and that will have, be able to say, like, you shouldn't have done this, should have done this. I mean, that's the hard thing, is that, Grace was talking about that the governor is listening to the advice of health experts. And I 100% believe that to be the case. I think that he very much puts his faith in Commissioner Malcolm and Chris Erzman and the other public health experts who talk to him. However, an average Minnesota citizen looks at, the trend line of COVID cases and COVID hospitalizations and deaths in Minnesota, and then compares it to Wisconsin or North Dakota or South Dakota, states that had very different approaches to dealing with the pandemic, and the lines are similar. And so they say to themselves, like, I understand, like, that you're taking advice from health experts in this, and they say, do all of these things. And so we've done them. But in some ways, it doesn't seem to have had an impact in the way that we would anticipate. And I'm talking now just as on behalf of, a regular citizen of Minnesota. I think if you dive into this, there certainly are impacts related to these public health measures. But, lots of people are going to look at it and say, you closed these restaurants, 25% of the restaurants in Minnesota are going to go out of business. You didn't have to do that. You could have done it differently the way these other states did, or you could have done this other thing differently, and the outcome would have been better. So there will be a lot. I think of it sometimes in these terms. I was the director of communications for Governor Pawlenty when the 35W bridge collapse happened. And it was a horrible tragedy. 13 Minnesotans died when the 35W bridge fell into the Mississippi River, one of the worst days in the history of our state. This COVID pandemic is like having a 35W bridge collapse in terms of the number of deaths every day, and sometimes 3 times, 4 times, 5 times that many deaths in one day for months. I mean, you got to let that sink in. Like that, the bridge collapse was a terrible tragedy. This is an ongoing tragedy of significant magnitude that the governor is trying to manage. So I think it will be interesting. I also think that the economy in 2022 is going to be pretty good, because if we're largely vaccinated, if we're back out, if there's been some federal stimulus, I think it's going to be the new roaring 20s. I think everyone will want to get out of their houses. They will want to go see live music. They will want to go to shows. They'll want to go to sporting events, because we have all this pent up desire to be out again. And so my general sense is that the economy is going to do well in 2022. And generally speaking, that's a positive for incumbents. And so we'll see how that unfolds. But I think that could benefit Governor Walz.
Grace, I'm going to give you a chance to respond if you want to that. I just want everyone who is watching to knock on wood for that prediction for a roaring 20s. But Grace, did you have anything you wanted to respond with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing I would say is, like, it's super easy to throw stones, right? And like I was about to say, hindsight is 2020, but like that phrase, I think we need to find a new one, because that phrase feels upsetting now. But of course, it's super easy to look in the rearview mirror and see, like, oh, maybe if we had done something differently, this would have happened. But I think anyone who wants to question what the leaders of our state have been doing of this time are kidding themselves if they think they can understand just how difficult and painful these decisions are.
So we're getting towards the end of our time. If anybody has any last questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A. But I was thinking about, this is a Minneapolis Regional Chambers event, and probably some of the folks who are watching. What is it that the folks who are paying attention to this upcoming or this current legislative session should be doing, should be engaging, especially as we noted, it looks totally different than any other session we've had. It's unprecedented, to use our title, because you can't go and have a day at the Capitol the same way. You can't pull somebody just aside. So are there things that you're advising either your clients or just people like this term, this is like how you should engage, this is like what you should be trying to get done? Brian?
Yeah, I would say, those old-fashioned methods of reaching out, like a phone call or a letter, really matter because people, they're not used to getting that as much. So, make a phone call, ask for a Zoom meeting with your legislator if you really want to talk to them, because they can do that now, right? They're used to, you don't have to go in, they don't have to go in. Let's just pop on the screen and talk. So, reaching out to them through those methods. Email is fine, but the email system gets so clogged during the legislative session that I think it can become difficult. But, calling, setting up a virtual meeting, those kind of things still very much matter. And I'd encourage people to do that.
Can I just ask a very practical question, which I don't know, which is, I love writing letters. With the legislators not, though, at the Capitol, should I send it to the Capitol, or are they just not going to get that then because they're not coming in?
That's a good question. I think most of them at least stop in, or they have their legislative assistant bundle it up and send it to them at their homes. So yeah, I think so. And it's really trying to get the attention of their assistant so that you can get on the radar. So I still think it's a good way.
All right. Grace, anything that you're suggesting for folks in just how to participate, how to be engaged this year?
Yeah, I mean, and like we've talked about before, of course, it's a bummer that we won't be able to do those big rallies at the Capitol. Brian talked about Bemidji Day. My personal favorite was Zoo Day at the Capitol, when there were literally animals in the rotunda.
Oh man, and post Tiger King, that really would have been a thing.
But yeah, and I would hope that people don't think during this session is that just because you can't physically go to the Capitol, it does not mean you still don't have a voice. It may be a slightly less fun way to exercise your voice, but you still have one. And Brian talked about letter writing and emails, and particularly for letters, I think it's way more impactful when you're able to send a bunch at one time. One letter will hopefully get noticed, but 100 letters all packaged together will certainly get noticed. So I hope that coalitions are able to band together in that way. And we saw examples even towards the end of last year's legislative session of people having success doing great virtual events. And I know people are a little more burned out on those now, but that's still the reality that we're living in. And in all of these ways, the Chamber is really looking forward to being a great partner on this.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to Brian and Grace for this really informative, engaging hour that we've had together. Thank you to everybody who stuck with us for this hour. And thank you so much to the Chamber for putting this whole thing on. These are really valuable and enlightening for me, I know, and I hope for everybody who is watching. So with that, I will throw it back over to Christine.
Thanks so much, Tane, and thank you, Grace and Brian, for being with us today. I absolutely concur. This is always a great session. We're happy to have you all back. As we close out, again, I'd like to thank our sponsors today, CenterPoint Energy, Target, Wells Fargo, two missing here, Mortenson, and Xcel Energy. We thank them for supporting this series year over year. One thing I do want to tell you all is that we have the Chamber's annual meeting, which is coming up on January 28th. We're excited to say we're going to be broadcasting live from First Avenue, which makes my heart warm to say such a thing can happen, and hopefully we'll be there in person. But please go ahead and register. It will be a virtual event. You see the link on the bottom there, and we'll send that in follow up. And with that, again, thank all of you for taking the time. And again, thanks to our speakers and to Tane for supporting us today. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.